What I'm going to talk about today is the question of falling transit ridership and a particular subset of that question, which is the way our neighborhoods are changing, and particularly our housing costs rising in some places, influencing the levels of transit ridership we see, both within those neighborhoods and overall. And this work is fairly preliminary, so I do not have too many definitive answers, but I'll walk you through what we know so far, what we've done, and show you some things that I think are fairly suggestive. So to just sort of motivate this, the main, as Marlon mentioned, we had done some work at ITS for Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG. SCAG was concerned about this issue that is, if you saw the headline would say, Los Angeles is hemorrhaging bus riders, which it is. That transit ridership is falling dramatically in the United States. Bus trips in Los Angeles are down about 25% since 2009. You see similar declines along the smaller agencies in Los Angeles County. So Metro is the very big one, right? And then you see declines of a smaller magnitude, but similar throughout the country, right? So you have this situation where we're seeing dramatic drops in transit ridership in LA. Those are mirrored in most metropolitan areas in the country, and so total transit ridership in the country has been falling pretty dramatically since 2009. Just as a point of information, falling transit ridership isn't in some ways that new, right? So this, if you look at transit ridership per capita, like the share of the public that regularly rides transit, in Los Angeles that peaked in 1985, right? So transit has always been sort of on the downturn in terms of does the average person ride transit? What makes this particularly alarming is that in the last 10 years or so, transit has been falling in absolute terms. That even as our population's growing, the total number of boardings we're seeing is going down. And so that's prompted a lot of people to look into why this is the case. Over at ITS, we were among those folks. And as Marlon mentioned, we did this report for SCAG last year, and this report was not about sort of what's happening neighborhood to neighborhood. It was basically just looking at Southern California as a whole. What do we see that can explain falling transit ridership? And there's a bunch of different things going on. There's no one culprit, but the big driver we found is that if you just looked at the Southern California region, one of the biggest things that has changed in the last 20 years is the sheer number of households that have automobiles that didn't used to, right? So if you look back at the year 2000 or the year 1990, particularly among those groups of our population that are most likely to ride transit, which would be lower income households, lower income immigrant households, and then in particular lower income immigrant households where the immigrants came from, like Mexico or other parts of Latin America. They're a disproportionate share of our transit ridership. If you were to look at census data about those households in 1990 or 2000, a pretty large share of them either didn't have a car or had more adults than cars, right? Suggesting that if some of those adults wanted to get around, they were going to ride transit. That had fallen a lot by 2015, right? So if you just looked at sort of what's going on in the region, right? One of these big culprits seems to be, we just saw a lot of rising automobile ownership amongst that group of people most likely to ride public transportation. And so we put out this report, and the Southern California Association of Governments said, well, that's great, but there's still a bunch of unanswered questions, and we'd like you to do some more work. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is sort of some follow-up work. But I think one point to make about studying Southern California that's important is that there's only so much we can, yeah, it really is cut off, isn't it? There's only so much we can say, right, about, let me back up a second. It's good to have an understanding of what we can say about transit ridership in the United States by examining transit ridership in Los Angeles, right? And there's a fact about transit ridership in the United States is that it is very disproportionately concentrated in a handful of places, right? So 40% of the nation's transit ridership is in New York, maybe another 8 or so percent, 10% is in Chicago, and then you get similar percentages in what we call legacy cities like Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco, and Washington. And then there's just this long flat end of the tail, right, which is hundreds of other metropolitan areas. And so it's what's going on in the last 10 years in the US is both that transit ridership in total is going down and that it's falling in most places. And those two things don't have to be happening at the same time. Our transit ridership is so uneven, so unevenly distributed, that it's possible for transit ridership to be falling in hundreds of metropolitan areas. And if it goes up 10% in New York, national transit ridership goes up, right? And so all of this is a way of saying what's interesting to some respect about Los Angeles, and what this table kind of shows, right, is that Los Angeles has this unique position of being a pretty big transit market. Right? It's about 6% of the nation's transit ridership, and it has the characteristics of a small market. So what you see in this table is the first two columns basically just show, and I won't walk through all of it, that LA Metro riders, right, and this is from their rider surveys, are much poorer, have much lower socioeconomic status than people in LA County in general, right? That they have much more likely to be in poverty. They have much lower household income, 16,000 compared to 57,000. About 80% of them don't have a vehicle available to make their trip. That's only true of about 11% of households in the county. So our transit service really is a social service. It carries people who don't have other options for the most part. What the next three columns show is just the characteristics of transit riders in small, medium, and large-sized metropolitan areas. And the large ones, this is where you would have your Bostons, your Philadelphias, your New Yorks, et cetera. You can sort of ponder this, but I'll skip to the punchline. Los Angeles, the transit riders in Los Angeles look a lot more like the smallest metropolitan area transit riders than the biggest ones. That the characteristics of a transit rider in Los Angeles are more similar to the transit riders in Tulsa than they are to New York or Philadelphia, right? Because these other places that carry a lot of people, they have very transit-oriented built environments in their center city. They don't have a lot of parking, things like that. They carry many more people of many different SES or socioeconomic statuses than we do. And so what's interesting about looking at Los Angeles, in addition to the fact that this is where we all live, right, is that it can help explain what's going on in most places, even if it really can't explain what's going on with most riders. So that's an important distinction. Like what I'm going to tell you today probably does not have much bearing on what's happening in New York or Boston or Philadelphia. They're just way too different. But it probably does have some bearing, perhaps, on some other places, right? So one of the things that makes LA more like some other places and less like, a Boston or a New York is that compared to those places, the absolute quality of transit service is much lower. And then more importantly, the quality of that service is much more uneven across neighborhoods, right? That there's some parts of LA where transit service is okay. There's a small number where it's good. And then there's a lot of places where it's not very good. So you have this small number of places where transit ridership is a reasonable thing to do, and many places that aren't. And that suggests, right, that like if we start to lose those places, then that could have a big adverse impact on our overall ridership. If you have neighborhoods with fairly reliable rail service between big origins and destinations, right? So you could imagine Hollywood down to downtown, some of those neighborhoods with the red line, your purple line stop. There's probably some places along the orange line, the busway in the valley. Where you just basically where you get this advantage of speed that comes from being exempt from like the road traffic congestion. And then like that's the easiest one. And then like as you get further apart, you can say, well, maybe the Expo line, and that's probably true. But Expo also, as we all know, like it kind of stops at red lights. It doesn't have priority. So it's an advantage, but it's an advantage only when the traffic on the street is really bad. Right? And then you get sort of like my commute. A few days a week, I ride the number 2 bus on Sunset Boulevard. And that's, it's fine, but that's just slow, right? And so that's like, that would not be considered like a high quality, even though it's better than some of our other bus lines. If you're a transit rider in Los Angeles, this is a little bit of an oversimplification. You spend a lot of time thinking about ways not to be a transit rider, right? Because the service really isn't that good, right? So and that's a constant. As far as we could tell, service quality really didn't decline that much in the time when ridership went down. Some buses got slower because congestion got worse. But what seemed to have happened is that it just got a lot easier to buy a cheap car, right? And I think that it's very hard to find like really sort of systematic data about this. But I don't think we should underestimate what Craigslist did for people who wanted to buy cheap cars, right? If you don't have a lot of money, you got to buy a car in cash, right? It's hard to go get financing. You can do some buy here, pay here type stuff, but and buying a car in cash used to involve a lot of searching and a lot of coordination, right? And with Craigslist, suddenly you could go online and find 8 different options of cars that you might want and know what the price was and go get them. And I think that, combined with a few other things, led to a general surge in sort of cars at the low end of the spectrum. There were some other things that happened too, that a lot of leases ended nationally in the late 1990s, and so the used car market got flooded, and that brought prices down and things like that. But I think it's just the falling real price of a used car. You need a chunk of upfront money, right, to sort of get yourself into automobility. And if you don't have that, then you're sort of making these sort of smaller expenditures every day and decisions about how you travel. And I think for a lot of low-income people, like what we just see in revealed behavior is like, that's worth it. It's worth it to make that. Southern California is laid out for driving, right? And so if you don't have the ability to drive, you are participating in a very different world than the rest of the economy, and that's to your disadvantage. But I think the second part of your comment, which is very important, is that automobile ownership is what we call very sticky, right? That once you have it, precisely because you've sunk a bunch of money in it, and you have the money to pay for insurance, and you have a full tank of gas, what an economist would say is that you're not making as many sort of like marginal decisions about your travel. Like, sure, of course you're going to wake up and use your car. It's sitting outside, right? As opposed to if you didn't have a car, you could wake up and say to yourself, well, is today a bus day? Is it a walking day? Is this an Uber trip? And so you just kind of go more on autopilot. And so that's one reason I think it's sort of underappreciated why automobiles are so habit forming, right? Is because they do sort of take away that daily decision-making process. What this headline would say, right, this is from Tracy Jean Rosenthal, who's an organizer for the LA Tenants Union, is I think it said transit-oriented development or transit rider displacement, right? And so the hypothesis she puts forward here in this op-ed is basically that one thing that might be happening is that actually by building more transit, we are making neighborhoods more attractive, right? And as we make those neighborhoods more attractive, higher income people move in, they bid up the price of housing, they then displace the people who would be riding transit, right? And then the folks who have moved in are more affluent, they have cars, and so they don't make that daily decision. And so perversely, by building transit, you see your transit ridership go down, right? And so this is an argument that she made a nice case for it. She's certainly not the only person bringing it up. There's concern that transit itself causes gentrification. The gentrification reduces transit ridership. It turns out this is sort of hard to figure out if this is actually happening or not. So a colleague of mine at UCLA, Anastasia Lukaitis-Sedaris, along with Karen Chappell at UC Berkeley, they just released an entire book about this. And the evidence is very mixed at best. And I think you can, if you're familiar at all with our rail stops in Los Angeles, you could sort of see why it would be. Or if you look at like a place like Hollywood, yeah, we put some transit in, and after a lag of some years, we see a lot of upscale development happening there. But really just a few blocks away, down at like Vermont and Santa Monica or something like that, the rail stop has been there a long time, and there hasn't been much development. There hasn't been much development along the Blue Line. And so this seems to be a very ambiguous hypothesis right now, right? And that becomes even more ambiguous if you factor in that most transit ridership is actually bus ridership, right? And we build a lot of rail compared to other places, but we don't build that much rail, and we're losing a lot of bus riders. And so it seems hard to, at least at this point, make a case that by supplying transit, we're undermining it. I think it's probably happening in some neighborhoods, right? But as a generalized sort of cause of transit ridership, it doesn't seem to be, we don't have the data yet to say that. So I saw Professor Chappell give a talk about this, and she joked that the publisher gave the book away online for free for a month because like the evidence was so inconclusive. I don't think that's why they did that. But one more potentially more plausible hypothesis that's related, right, is not necessarily that transit causes high housing prices, but that high housing prices do undermine transit, right? And that would work like this. What that says is like what I just mentioned, that there's a very small and sort of lower income share of the population that accounts for most of our transit riders. So take that bullet like as a given. And then on top of that, a very small share of our land use accounts for most of our transit boardings, right? In most parts of LA County, transit isn't very good. Same with Orange County, right? And so you've got like a small share of places, a small share of people. And so if something happens, and housing prices is probably the most obvious hypothesis, that changes the neighborhood and sort of pushes those two factors apart, so that the people most likely to ride transit are no longer living in those neighborhoods where transit is best, well then, right, you could get falling ridership. And the important point, like in distinction to what my colleagues studied, is that it doesn't have to be transit that triggers this, right? I mean, and in most instances, it probably isn't. So if you think about a neighborhood like Echo Park, Echo Park has gotten really expensive in the last 10 years. And as a result, a lot of people who probably used to ride the number 2 bus no longer live there, and bus ridership on the number 2 has fallen. But people don't move to Echo Park to ride the number 2 bus, right? Riding the number 2 bus is kind of miserable, right? But the fact is that Echo Park became desirable for other reasons. Prices go up, and maybe, so this is what I'm going to try and test. And everybody should be clear about their biases. I have a strong prior belief that this is probably true. It's as I'll show you, it's sort of coming through in the data I have. So I'm inclined to believe this, but I don't think I have made the case yet. So there's different ways to measure this. There's some folks over at, again, you can't see this title, but this is a paper by some folks at Georgia Tech. They've talked about, who measured sort of falling bus ridership in 4 cities. They used, this is just kind of getting into some empirics here, they used data from a source called the LOADS, which is the Census Bureau's data that tracks employment. And the nice thing about that is that you can get data for every year, neighborhood by neighborhood. The unfortunate thing about it is you don't go back very far. The LOADS data sort of stops at around 2013, and it doesn't show you a lot of the demographics that we might be interested in. It doesn't show you housing prices, right? So I end up not using this in this paper that we're working on right now. And so the other thing to keep in mind, right, I just mentioned, this is just some considerations. You know, I mentioned the work I just did last time where I talked about like the real culprit sort of regionally is perhaps this rising car ownership. You're not going to see that too much in the analysis that comes just because of this sort of ecological fact that if you're analyzing what happens in a neighborhood, that doesn't necessarily sum to what's happening in a region, right? Which is to say that like it could be that rising housing prices lead to falling transit ridership neighborhood by neighborhood. And as people are pushed out of those neighborhoods where the housing prices are rising, they're further away from transit, and then they buy a car in another census tract, right? And so what you wouldn't see in the analysis here, and which I don't see, which is why I'm not going to show it to you, is that car ownership having a huge impact on the neighborhood level, right? Because if the mechanism that we're thinking about is like, oh, people are being pushed out, they can't ride transit anymore, they have to scramble and find a car, that's not going to happen in the unit of analysis that I'm looking at, right? So I think that that's just important. You know, some of these declines are going to manifest in, well, this really is cut off, in other tracks. And then the other big question is, well, how do you measure neighborhood change if you're going to do this? And part of what I'm trying to avoid when I do this is getting into this question of like, well, what's gentrification? Because like you could write not just a paper, but an entire book about that. Obviously, we probably all have our own definitions. It's usually some combination of like changes in housing values, changing in housing rents, changes in racial composition, changes in educational attainment. All of these are changes in incomes. They're all valuable metrics. I would say that before this project is over, myself and my co-author, Hannah King, will probably test all of them. But for the moment, if you just think about like what we're talking about is the main mechanism by which this will probably happen, it's probably some form of housing prices and specifically rents, right? And that it's the rising rents that are going to trigger these other changes, the racial composition and so forth. And I'm going to focus on that. I'm happy to answer questions about the other ones, though, as well. So what we're doing data-wise is as follows. You can't really see the most important part, which is that we got from LA Metro and the Orange County Transportation Authority, which are the two biggest transit providers in LA County and Orange County. There's other providers, for sure, like the Santa Monica Big Blue Bus is a reasonably sized provider. LA DOT is a reasonably sized provider. But by having data from Metro and OCTA, you get the most geographically complete providers, and you probably have about 90% of the transit ridership in these two counties covered. Also, we asked some of the other agencies for their data, and they just didn't have it going back far enough. So what we have is boarding data from all their stations for 2 5-year periods. Right? The first 5-year period is 2008 through 2011, and the second one is 2012 through 2017. And we took those and we averaged them, right? So to make sort of one observation. And we did that 5-year average for a reason, which is once you do that, then you can match the boardings to census tract data from the American Community Survey, which has census tract data only available in 5-year chunks, right? So the disadvantage here is that first period from 2008 to 2011 means that we have both the recession and the recovery in it. No way to avoid that. We could go back earlier, but once you go back earlier, you lose geographic conformity. The boundaries of the census tracts change, and we wanted to keep the neighborhood unit intact. I don't think it's a huge problem that we have that sort of recession and recovery in there, but it's there, and I'm happy to talk more about it. So we matched that with some demographic data from the census, the SES of the tract. We map the rail and bus stations in all these places. We map the density of the street network, which is a sort of way of measuring how pedestrian-friendly the area is. And then we don't have this yet, but we're going to put in jobs data for those tracts, how much employment there is, what kind of employment, et cetera. And I think once that does go in, a lot of what I'm going to show you is going to be a lot clearer. So having done that, right, some quick some descriptive results just from looking at this, and then I'll show you some maps. If you look at all these census tracts in LA County and Orange County, it's about 2,800 census tracts. Unsurprisingly, more places lost riders than gained riders. And of the places that lost, they lost more than the places that gained. And so you can see these statistics. About 25% of tracks gained rides, about 54% lost. 21% of the tracks were always zero, and these are also places that basically like have no bus stops. There's very few places that have 0 rides and transit service. And 3% essentially didn't change. They probably changed a little bit, but remember we took like a 5% average, and so they end up being roughly the same. And the losses are concentrated in very dense areas, which is where the transit ridership is historically. And the gains are very concentrated near places where LA Metro opened new rail. And so I think, this is kind of like a heat map. The red is just sort of like the biggest losses, and the green, as you get darker green, are the biggest gains. And what you basically see, again, this is cut off a little bit. The white area are the 600 or so tracks that just have no rides, basically, or no change. And these are largely places that are predominantly white, predominantly detached single-family home, very suburban in orientation. You wouldn't expect them to have a lot of transit ridership. If we take this map, what we can see of it, and overlay the rail system, one thing you see is, well, you see two things. One is that in the areas, especially in LA County here, where you see the hubs of the rail system, right, like Metro and 7th Street, the downtown, things like that, that's the biggest losses are there, right? And this, in some ways, this is just like an arithmetical fact. If you're going to lose a lot of transit rides, it has to happen where there were a lot of transit rides. And so where there were a lot of transit rides was in dense areas that have a lot of jobs and dense housing, right? Where you see gains happening are very much along where the Expo line is. You can see that along the top. And then also we're in the Gold Line extension, right? And so I think before we sort of jump to the conclusion that what we should be doing is building more rail, you should also notice that just outside that band of green where the Expo line is, there are big bands of red. And so there's reason to think that what happened is the Expo line was opened and a lot of bus riders nearby poured onto the Expo line. That basically you had a shift in ridership rather than a big boost. Certainly some of it was probably new, right? But that the sort of bands of red around the green are quite telling. So this just shows sort of descriptive statistics on boardings in period 1 and period 2, right, and some other things. And then this is boardings per capita, right? So rather than just absolute boardings, this is like boardings per person that lives in that tract. And what you can't see is that, but it probably isn't surprising when I tell you, is that the mean here is much larger than the median, right? Which is to say that, there's a lot of places where there's just very little boardings, right? And then some places where there's lots and lots of them, right? This is another way of just illustrating the fact that our transit ridership is heavily concentrated in a handful of places. And so you can see this here. What you can't see is that the 25th percentile in boarding, so a quarter of tracks, their average boardings are only about 2,100. And the 95th percentile is 690,000. Right? So there's just like, there's some census tracts that just generate a massively disproportionate share of our transit ridership. The same thing is true for boardings per capita, where the 25th percentile is down under 1, right? And the top percentiles are closer to 200. So just really driving home the fact that we do have a lot of concentrated ridership, and that losses are concentrated where the ridership is concentrated, right? So you see that in the 95th percentile, you see the biggest drops, right? 7% the reduction, 5% reduction. Whereas in the 25th percentile, you actually see some small gains, right? But those percentage gains just don't mean very much because so few people were riding there. OK, so look at the sort of absolute and percentage changes. Again, we see sort of the same thing. So what I just showed you there are just boardings in period 1 and period 2. What this shows you is the change in ridership in a given tract between period 1 and period 2. Same sort of thing. That in a small handful of places, your losses are very large, right? And in a handful of places, for the most part, they're much smaller. So again, all the action is happening in this small share of census tracts. So with that in mind, let's think about what's leading to some of these concentrated gains and losses. What I did is I took a look at the decile, the top 10, the 10% of tracks that had the biggest gains in transit ridership, the biggest absolute shift. And what you see there, right, is the following: that there's 274 tracks in that decile that didn't get new rail, and they averaged about 76,000 new boardings between period 1 and period 2. There were 19 tracks that added at least one rail station. They gained about 418,000 new rides. So basically, a lot of the action in sort of like seeing at the neighborhood level an increase in transit ridership was somebody opened a rail station, right? And so the other ones are more interesting in some ways, but that's what's going on. In terms of doing the same thing with the tracks that lost rides, so the decile of tracks that had the biggest decline, what we see is that that this is like, there's a lot going on here. What that just flying by just showed you and you missed, it basically said that these 280 or so tracks lost the equivalent of 8% of all the metro and octro ridership. Like huge amounts of ridership, just the change in ridership was the equivalent to 8% of all rides. And these accounted for 73% of all the losses, right? So most of the losses are happening in these places, and they are among the highest ridership tracks, which again makes sense. You can't lose that much ridership unless you have it to begin with, right? So this, to put some specificity on that, within this decile, almost all of them are in the top 20% of ridership tracks, right? From period 1, almost 60% are in the top 10%, and about 32% are in the top 5. So basically, if you just pulled out in that first period all your tracks that were performing best, a lot of them, if you looked to the next period, they were the tracks that lost the most, right? OK, so. But there's very few of them were in the top 1%. So this is kind of interesting, and we're going to revisit this. The 1% of tracks that like really had the most ridership in the first period seemed fairly resistant to falling ridership. I suspect that has something to do with downtown LA, but I'm not sure. OK, so what we did here, and which again you can't see too well, is we looked at this decile of tracks that accounts for 73% of all the losses and compared them to all the other tracks. And the short version of this story is basically that, and looked at how they've changed over time. The short version of this story is that you do see rising rents and home values and a falling share of low-income people in this decile of tracts that account for most of the ridership. You don't see that as much in the rest of the county. You do see that rents rose everywhere, right? This is like LA from 2008 to 2019. But they rose from a kind of higher base in the other places, right? Because you're talking about if rents rise in West LA or parts of the valley, that they're going from $1,700 a month to $2,300 a month or something. That's not going to have a big impact on transit ridership. Like those folks were probably driving to begin with. And then you have sort of, this is just the ratio of these places to every other place. And I think what it basically shows you is that, again, the places that are losing most of the transit ridership, they're much poorer. They're much more likely to be non-white. They have lower median home values. It's everything you might expect of a high transit area. So what this is basically showing is that these places are also, they're much denser. They have more service. They seem to be losing their share foreign-born, and they seem to be losing their low-income people. So this is all a way of saying the groundwork descriptively for this hypothesis seems to be getting borne out, right? That we have a small share of places that account for most of the losses. Those places are very low income. They do seem to have rising rents. They do seem to have some changes in their composition that would suggest those rising rents leading to lower income people no longer living there as much, right? Okay, so one very big difference, right, between the two is if you try and calculate a measure of the housing burden, right, which what I've done here is the ratio of the change in rent in period 1. This is a little bit complicated, so I wish it was on the screen. The change in rent in period 1 to the median income, so the change in rent from period 1 to period 2 to the median income in period 1, right? So basically, if you just say, like, how much did rent go up in this census tract over these 5 years? And then what is that as a share of what the median income in that tract was in 2010? And the reason I did that is we could interpret that as saying, how much harder would it be for you to live in this census tract 5 years later if you had the same income as someone who is there now? So it's a measure of the change in the added burden of housing costs. If you do that, then a really big difference pops up between this decile of tracts that lost a lot of ridership and all the others. It's about 50% higher in those tracts than it is in other tracts in the region, right? There's also a very large difference if you just calculate the ratio of the change in income to the change in rent, which seems more straightforward, but actually isn't because it becomes a lot harder to interpret. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but like that is a very large difference that I'm not going to return to in this talk. Some different considerations before we get into sort of the regressions and so forth. One of the things you have to think about now, given everything I've told you, is that you have to kind of now control for basically the simultaneity of poverty and transit ridership, which is to say that like because most of the rides were in absolute terms are in poorer places, right? If you just sort of, and that's where most of the ridership change happened. Like if you sort of set this up wrong, you could arrive at the conclusion that like more poverty causes less transit ridership. And so this is just a way of saying like we have to control for that. So I'm not going to dwell on this very much. These are just very straightforward regressions that are just levels that just, for everyone who's interested in regressions, you can look at this and be comforted with the fact that like if you just say like what determines transit ridership in period 1 and period 2, it makes sense, right? That like denser places with fewer whites and fewer detached single-family homes, et cetera, they tend to have more transit ridership. This is, if more than anything else, this is just makes my co-author and I feel comfortable that our data are sensible, right? And so now we get to this question of like how do we want to model the change in boardings? And you can do that 2 ways. I mean, you can probably do it a bunch of ways. I'm going to give you 2 ways. One way is to say, let's just look at how many boardings there are in period 2 as a function of how everything changed between period 1 and period 2. And the other is to actually use as a dependent variable the swing in ridership, right? And I'm going to focus on the first one, but I'll show you a little bit of both. And how much time do I have? OK. So I hope everybody likes regressions, because now I got a bunch of them. So the key point, right, is that there's a pretty sizable negative coefficient attached to the change in the median rent. And so controlling for a bunch of other things, what that says is that, the coefficients themselves are just Poisson coefficients. They probably don't make a lot of sense to look at. But if you turn them into something a little more sensible, it says for every roughly $230 increase in rent that happened from period 1 and period 2, you get about a 7% reduction in your expected count of transit boardings, right? Some other things it says that you can kind of see that also make sense, that if you an absolute increase in the population of white people by about 300, it's about a 1% drop in the expected count of boardings. An increase in the share of poor people and an increase in the share of black people they are associated with increases. And then, of course, you can see this coefficient on new rail. If you open a new rail station, you get a giant increase, right? And remember, it's probably not a net increase, but it's big. OK, so this is a fairly parsimonious regression, by which I mean, like, all I've done is just looked at the changes, and I haven't done anything really to control for the initial conditions in those census tracts, right? So it doesn't say anything about how much ridership there was, how many immigrants there were before, et cetera. There's different ways to control for initial conditions. We've done a bunch of them. I'm going to show you a very simple one. The very simple one is just to control for some measure of the amount of boardings that happened in the first period. Because I remember, as I showed you in that very quick regression before, those boardings are themselves a function of the share of immigrants, the share of people in poverty, and so forth. So here's another regression you can't see. But if I control for boardings, and on the one hand boardings and the other boardings per capita in the first period, and then run the same sort of analysis, what you get is the rent increase is a little bit smaller. The effect associated with the rent increase is a little bit smaller. It's about 6% rather than 7%. The increase in median income is associated now with about a 4% reduction. The magnitudes on a lot of the other stuff stay the same. Just as a couple things we can talk about in the Q&A if you like, that what happens when the change in the housing units really varies with the model specification, right? This is like a big question around transit, right? If you build more housing near it, do you get more or less ridership? I'm getting inconsistent results depending on what I do. If you control for initial conditions, and this also makes sense, the share white doesn't really, it sort of flips. And the poverty increase is now associated with a small decline, which is, again, probably a function of controlling for all the poverty that was there beforehand by controlling for initial conditions. So having done that, right, so we have the boardings in period 1, the boardings in period 2. We have some evidence that rent is associated with falling ridership. Come back to the question of, like, well, it's not just rent alone, right? It's also rent as some function of how well you can pay it. Right, this goes back to what I was saying about, like, if the rent just pops up in West LA and you have plenty of money, does that mean you really ride transit less? And so what this shows is the change in boardings per capita, right, as well as that added burden variable I told you about before. That change in the change in the rent from period 1 to period 2 as a function of the first period median income. And what we see here, right, is that, well, what you can't see is that the coefficient's gigantic. But what it means basically is that a 1 increase in the standard deviation of that variable leads to about a 7% decline in the expected count of boarding. So it's giving more credence to the idea that rent matters, right? And the top decile tracts that account for a lot of these losses, they have about a standard deviation greater measure of that than other places do. And so if we think about this, though, right, this captures, right, places that have both high and low incomes and high and low rents, because it's just kind of measuring a change. And so one way to sort of really focus on what we think are areas that are prone to be sort of gentrified is to drop the variable that I have in there right now that measures the change in the poverty, right, and instead insert a new variable that's just a dummy that says this is indicating if it's a high poverty tract. Right, and a high poverty tract for this purposes of this is that it has 28% poverty or greater, which is basically a standard deviation above the mean census tract poverty level. And then interact that dummy variable with this change variable, which so basically it's going to show the combined effect of having rents rise as a greater share of income and the fact that it was poor to start. And so what do we get? The combined effect basically, well, one, you see that a high poverty tract, it just predicts a lot of transit ridership, which isn't that surprising. But in places where you have a high poverty tract where the rent to income ratio is rising faster, you see a very large decline in the expected count of transit ridership, right? Which makes sense given everything we're saying. I apologize that you can't see it on the slide itself. And then what I basically have is just to close out, a couple of things that kind of reinforce that. What this shows is instead of measuring sort of what's going on in the second period, right, as a function of changes in the first, this is an ordinary least squares regression that measures the absolute change, right? So the dependent variable now is just like that swing in ridership, right? And what these regressions show you basically is the change in median rent doesn't have a huge impact on this. It's statistically insignificant, at least in these specifications. But that second indicator of like the increase in the burden has a very large impact. It shows up a lot in the change in ridership. It basically suggests a very large decrease in ridership in those tracks. And so when you have a situation where high poverty combined with a bigger rent to income ratio, it suggests a very large drop between period 1 and period 2. OK, so just to wrap this up, so what do I have here? I have like suggestive evidence that people are at the neighborhood level being kind of priced away from transit. Far from conclusive. We're doing a lot more work on this. All these models need to be refined. We have to test them against other measures of neighborhood change. I think it's going to help a lot. At the end of this week, my co-author is going to get us some jobs data that's going to help clarify a lot of this. And then the other thing we want to do is measure some of these rail spillovers. Like we've been building with GIS some buffers that show how close bus stops are to new rail. We think that'll clarify things as well. But that's where we're at. I appreciate your attention, and I am happy to take questions.